Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to be taking a look at some hopefully creative uses of some of the features of the sampler track. So sampler tracks have been in Cubase for a while now, and they've always been slightly weird because it's a new class of track rather than creating just a standalone VST instrument. That comes with some benefits in terms of integration, but it's slightly limited in some ways. So there's some advanced features, which hopefully this video will cover interesting uses of those features, but it's also kind of limited and has fewer features than an S900 from back in the day. So bit of a weird thing. So the first technique I want to cover is what I've called reverse shuffle. So this is combining two elements of the sampler track. So we're slicing the sample up and then we're reversing each one of those slices, and you get a kind of electro-y reverse effect, but it's not as straightforward as just putting something reverse on there because each individual slice is reversed. So if we play the original, you get the idea. And then if I put in the shuffled version, so you can hear, particularly on the snares, we're getting those reverse sections leading up to it. If I just play just the sampler track, so we can hear that it's there and it sounds backwards, but there's more to it than that. It's not just the whole thing reversed because that wouldn't work in the same way. So now let's have a look at how that was created. So here we have the sampler track, and this has just got that sample imported. So if I play it on my keyboard, you can hear it's just playing normally. So this is going to combine two elements of the sampler track, slicing, but also reversing each of those slices. Now, when you slice any sample up in sampler tracks, it will create a MIDI part which you can drag to another track. Now, if we do this by default, so you turn on the slicing here, so it's this power button here. It's a bit weird, but you turn it on there, and then to get access to the slice controls, it's this here. So you can pick whether it's in grid mode, etc., that kind of thing. I've set it to grid mode. I've set the grid to 8s to get these slices happening like that, but you can set it into transient and then it would pick up the volumes, etc. But I just wanted to have these individual samples just be on the 8s because the sample's in time and it's just going to make it easier for me to work like that. Now, once you've done that, you can drag your MIDI from here onto the track you want to play. And generally that would be the sampler track, but you might want to do something weird with it. And if we drag it on here, this works all the way across there. Now, you may find that you run out of notes. Now, if you do run out of notes, all you need to do before you do that is to move your root key down. So if you moved it down to C0, you would have enough notes. If you have a longer sample, you'll end up with one of these slices just being at the end all on its own because it's run out of notes. But that hasn't happened here. So that's the first step, and if we just play this back now, we get exactly the same effect as before, just playing the sample. Because each one of these samples you can see going across the screen here are being triggered by these notes here. So you can use this creatively if you want to. If you want to cut this up, you can just open this up and then you can move things around. So instead of playing it in the normal order, you can swap things around or repeat parts. So let's say you wanted to have a double snare like that, you could play that, etc., that kind of thing. So just by randomly moving these around, you can get some interesting cut and paste kind of breakbeaty effects. But we're not going to do that today, although you could do, and you could extend that to this, but then we're going to reverse the sample. Okay, so now each one of these little samples will be reversed. And then we get the effect, which now sounds... Typically, you wouldn't probably play that all the way through. The place that I like it particularly is where the snare happens. So it's like just on this fourth one. So you'd probably come through and you might remove the notes, or you might just choose to mute them. And then you just get them happening in those places. So let's just pull those out. So you just get a more subtle thing. So if we play that, you can hear that without and then with. So for me, I think that's much easier than slicing up all your samples and reversing the selected parts, etc. Because this is semi-automating the process, and then with mute, etc., you can pick and choose what you want. You could even move them around to different places, so you get a particular reverse snare, this, that, and the other. There's lots of creative possibilities just with this, and you can get lots of detail and interest into your programming and production just by using these kind of techniques. So that's what I've called reverse shuffle. Let's take a look at the next technique. So this is pitch shifting. At the time of recording, Cubase doesn't have a pitch shifting plugin built in. You can pitch shift audio, etc., but I thought it'd be interesting to look at a different way of doing it and the effects that you get from doing that, because the way you process the audio, you get a different effect, even if, you know, on the tin, as it were, they're doing the same thing. So here's our original audio. And here it is with the sampler track built in. So this is pretty straightforward, but it's a way that you can be more creative effectively in real time when you are doing your production. So all we've done here is load this sample in, and then importantly, under playback, I've activated audio warp mode. So if you're not aware, audio warp mode allows you to change the pitch of the note without changing the timing of it. So this sample, if we had audio warp turned off, if I play it at the original pitch, which is A3, that's just playing normally. Now, if I play an octave down, yeah, it's an octave down, but the problem is it's at half the speed. Now, that may work in some situations, and you may come up with some creative things, but that's not what we want in this case. So if you turn audio warp on, what happens is it effectively will time stretch it to fit. So we can play the A. And it's maintaining the timing regardless of the note that I play. So now, obviously, if I play it an octave lower, we're getting that texture thickening effect. And as you can see here, the MIDI note is just that A down an octave. So that's why we're getting that thickening. Now, it's not perfect. There's some little timing differences, etc., in there, and you often need to play around with these settings to get this to sound right. Now, the original BPM setting here is a little bit, yeah, I would just leave that as it was. So either you stay in out of sync mode and leave it 100%, or put it in sync mode and leave it at the original BPM. If you change it, you will get different tempo effects. The mode here will depend on the sample you're using. So in this particular one, music works because if we put it in solo, and let's actually solo this track. You can hear you get all those wobbly notes because it's not intended to be anything other than a monophonic performance, I believe. So if one mode doesn't work for you, maybe the other one will. And sometimes the artifacts you get from this are nice. Now, the upside of using solo mode is you get format controls, so you can change the sound in a interesting way, which we'll look at a bit later on. But the other thing that this gives you, which maybe using pitch shifting on a sample wouldn't do, is the ability to play multiple notes on the same sample. So this won't work so well with this, but if we got the original A, an A and an E, and you can play around with that, experiment with it in real time. Now, clearly, if you've got a different length loop, or you've got a loop which repeats every bar, etc., then that will work in a different way. But there's lots of experimentation and fun, effectively, by turning on audio warp and then being creative with the notes that you're playing. So this next one is an extension of what we've just seen, but it works slightly differently because of the nature of the sample we're using. So all we've got is a simple clap. Now, certainly I find claps often need to be tuned to the track that they're in. If you just leave them at the original pitch, they don't always work. I don't go to the extent of, you know, the great producers where they spend a week tuning a drum kit, etc., to fit the key of the track. But often I think claps seem to have a pitch to them, and you can fine tune them and make them sit better, or make them stand out by making them effectively not sit better by playing around with them. This, again, allows you to do it in real time. So all we've done here is on the sampler track, I've just drag that sample in so you can see it's the same sample being played. Ignore the tempo, it's not worked that out properly, has it? And again, we're using audio warp mode. Now here is where it becomes interesting, because if we go back to 100%, then depending on where I am on my keyboard, because we're in audio warp mode, we get a same length clap, but at a different pitch. Now, you can influence that by changing this speed here. So at the moment, we're in music mode, and we'll see that the mode really makes a difference here. So you can get all those kind of Fatboy Slim, extreme slowed down samples. And if we go to 0, it still plays, but it sounds very much like those kind of mid-90s effect. Speeding it up, you get a shorter one, but it definitely works differently to how you would expect that. And if you put it to about 200% and then play an octave lower, you're getting quite a different sound than you would have done otherwise. So there's a lot of experimentation to do with that, to fine-tune it, which you don't get with other sample techniques. If you go to solo mode, the format control turns up, but also it sounds different. And to demonstrate that, let's just take the speed down to 0. Now, you'll remember that previously in musical mode, it played the entire sample slowly. If you leave it on 0 here, we just get just that first bit. It never gets out of jail. It's just stuck there. So there's lots of weird, glitchy noise terrorism to be had here that you can play around with. It would be nice if there was more modulation available, if we had a modulation matrix that would allow you to control this speed. But then that would be edging dangerously into the territory of the sampler track working like a proper sampler. And I don't think anyone wants that at Steinberg. But there we go. So there's some playing around to be done with this. Obviously, away from these extremes, it can be more useful, and we get kind of quite a nice damping effect to it there. And formant changes. You get this feeling you're tuning it without tuning it. So it's doing something that I don't think is available with any other sort of technique in the same way. So if you want to fine tune a clap, snare, etc. sample, this is a nice way to do it. You can hear we're getting some interesting resonances out of it there, and some different ones there. So again, there's lots of options, not an infinite number, but certainly a great deal of experimentation that you can do just with a simple sample. And obviously it will be different depending on the sample that you load. So this I call fix for echo. So this is using the pitch fix mode of the sampler track to allow you to play multiple versions of the same sample. So the sample we've got is just a straightforward bit of trumpet sample. It doesn't really matter what it is. It's just something that had a bit of melody in there that I thought would be useful for demonstrating effectively an echo or delay effect. So in the sampler track, again, just loaded this up, but I've used fix. So it's on fixed pitch. Now, the reason I've done this is that it means you can play multiple versions of the same note and effectively have the same effect. So I fixed the pitch and I turned audio warp on. So with those two things turned on, if I play any note on the keyboard, whether it's the original note, an octave up, or anywhere else, I get the same note. And you may think, well, what's the point of that? The reason is that you can then trigger multiples of the same sample in the same sampler track. So you don't have to mess about. So you can create a kind of playable delay. So if I play, they are velocity sensitive. So this one was very quiet. So the last one I played, and the notes here aren't important. I'm just playing the notes that kind of fall under my fingers of my hands. But the nice thing is you can then remove one of them. So let's say you want just a bit of delay in the first bit and then you want it to then play the end bit. You can so there's, again, that's a fairly simple example, but there's some creative possibilities in there where you're effectively playing a delay, and you could use that to change the way the delay sounds over the course of the track. So you obviously, if you were just going to create a straightforward delay, you wouldn't use that kind of thing. You'd just put a delay plugin in. But if you want to have something that varies, or it creates an echo which you can't get by any other delay method, so maybe you want something where you've got initially an eighth and then 3/16 in the left, but then you want something else in the right, you can do that with this, and you can effectively play any delay you want. So while I'm sure there are plugins that allow you to control with an infinite amount of controls the way that you make that delay, I don't think there are any which you can interrupt a delay at a particular point, whereas this allows you to do that. So particularly if you had a longer sample or maybe some overlapping drums, you could do something, again, interesting and creative by spending a bit of time just playing around with this. And this is the kind of thing where I think if you spend a bit of time noodling with your favorite drum or melodic sample, you'll come up with something interesting that you possibly wouldn't have done any other way. Now, this last tip is mono legato. So this is another mode of the sampler track which allows you to experiment and play with something in real time. So here's the original sample. Apologies for anybody who's watching this early in the morning. You get the idea with that kind of sample. Now, again, I've just loaded this up and then I've just looped the first bit. So this is fairly straightforward. Nothing particularly interesting about that. So if I just play this, it will just loop ad infinitum. So the loop is important as far as I'm concerned for this bit. Now, the key here is to turn on monophonic mode and then make sure that legato mode is turned on. And then this will respond to the keys that you play. So if you look at the keys that I'm playing down at the bottom of the screen, so by holding those notes down, in fact, if I change it to a different octave, so let's say, or not a different octave, if I just play a bit lower so you can see both notes I'm playing, because we don't get to see the C here clearly. So if I start on a G and then play up to B, for the legato to work or to keep it smooth, what I'm doing is just holding down that original G and then playing the other notes that I want to play. I'll go back to doing that with the C. So that works to make this playable. So you can play all sorts of things all over. The octave was quite, it was late at night when I was experimenting with this, so I thought it was much cooler than it might be, but... So you can see by changing those notes, you can play around with it and you can get lots more mileage out of an original sample. It sounds much more like it was played like that. There's more though. If you want to go full on, you can change your pitch bend range. So here I'm going to change it to 12. And then you've got full on. So as long as you keep one note pressed down all the time, you're good to go with this, and you can just mash it as much as you like, really. So it's much more like having a playable synth where, particularly if you've got a pitch bend wheel you can play around with, there's sometimes the dynamics of that pinging back actually create something quite nice. But again, while I think it's probably more suited to this style where you've got, an electronic synth bass loop, etc., something a bit acidy sounding that then you can play around with, because that's definitely that sort of style, that fits into that idiom really well. Again, it's the kind of thing you can spend a while playing around with. You can record it or obviously get it back with retrospective record, but you'll find something interesting again, which is making samples more playable, because I think one of the problems with a lot of sampling is that it becomes just this, I just do this, I just press a button, that's it. Whereas this is a much more tangible technique. You don't have to have a complicated MIDI controller to do this. As long as it's got pitch bend and some keys that work, you'll be in business, and you can come up with something again, which is more interesting than the original loop was, because this original loop, I quite liked it, but it's a bit mundane. It just does the same thing all the time. Whereas if you can add in a few shifts of notes here and there and a bit of pitch bend, etc., and keep that going, that to me is more interesting in this kind of thing. Again, all these little things which will make your productions more interesting. So there you go. That's 5 techniques for using the sampler track, which hopefully make it more interesting and show you some of the features in there that you can experiment with. There's lots of different ways you can use all of these techniques and possibly even combining some of them. They're not necessarily the kind of things you'll use all day, every day, but they are the kind of things that can just add in a little bit of interest into the productions that you make and possibly take you in new musical directions. As ever, hope you found this video useful. And if you have, please comment, like, and possibly even subscribe. And we'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.